Okay, you're recording.
So yeah, we're doing lots of technology. This is for a friend, a very close friend who can't be here, and then we've got my dad and his girlfriend. So, and I'm a little bit sick, and so I apologize if I cough. I will do my best. So thank you again. Thank you so much for everybody for being here, and thank you, Sonia and Helen, for being here as well. I'm excited to share my thesis with everybody. It's definitely been a lot of work and a lot of time with all of it in my head, so I'm glad to actually tell other people about it finally. So my thesis is entitled Ghanaian Nurses, Nutrition and Young Child Feeding Education, a Need for Further Education. So during the course of this presentation, I'll take you through the background that provides the foundation for my research, report the purpose, present my methodology, and then the results and implications from my research. So malnutrition is a global concern, and malnutrition includes conditions of both undernutrition, like stunting and wasting, and overnutrition, like overweight and obesity. In sub-Saharan Africa, they have seen slow progress to reduce rates of child stunting and wasting, as well as rates of overweight and obesity are rising in children. In Ghana, children under 5, with that population, there is an 11% rate of underweight, 19% are stunted, 5% are wasted, and 3% are overweight. The World Health Organization and the UN both track a number of health indicators to measure a country's progress towards reducing child morbidity and mortality. Ghana is currently off track to meet both the 2025 WHO Global Nutrition Targets and the UN Millennium Development Goals. So there are a number of factors affecting malnutrition. Of course, you have nutrition and also child feeding practices and environmental practices, such as access to clean water and sanitation. There are also a number of factors affecting child morbidity and mortality. Factors that increase rates of child morbidity and mortality are things like poor nutrition, poor intake or lack of access to safe and nutritious foods, and poor child feeding practices, such as lack of breastfeeding or reduced rates and brief durations of breastfeeding, and improper child feeding practices such as the early initiation of complementary feeding. There are also factors that can decrease child morbidity and mortality, such as good nutrition and good intake, and also child feeding practices such as responsive feeding. And responsive feeding is when parents and caregivers are attentive and prompt in their support of children, particularly during mealtime. Parents and caregivers are the gatekeepers to children's diets and enable them to establish healthy eating habits and good child feeding practices. They also shape children's views and understanding of nutrition. Because of this important role, it's important that parents and caregivers have accurate nutrition and child feeding knowledge from reputable sources. Nutrition misinformation, negative health outcomes can precipitate from nutrition misinformation. Previous research in Ghana, and particularly in the Kia region, which is the Komenda, Adina, Igafo, Abrem region, has shown that nurses are the primary educators of nutrition and child feeding. In Ghana, and throughout Africa, throughout the United States, and in Europe, nursing education tends to lack in-depth nutrition and child feeding knowledge. While many reports state that nurses view nutrition and child feeding education as important, it doesn't generally form an in-depth part of nursing curriculum. Many reports show that by increasing the knowledge and training in nutrition and young child feeding of nurses, you can increase their awareness and improve their attitudes towards those that suffer from conditions of malnutrition. As nurses are in a key role to act as educators in the area of nutrition and child feeding, they must be able to remain current on their information and also have access to education resources, particularly resources that are culturally appropriate and at the appropriate knowledge level for their population. So there are a couple of gaps in the research. For one, how to educate Ghanaian mothers about nutrition and child feeding. Secondly, how nurses in developing countries can remain current on their nutrition and child feeding information. And finally, While the World Health Organization and the UN do gather data on child health indicators for children up to age 5, most of the research on education in nutrition and child feeding focuses on children ages 0 to 2. Thus, there is a lack of information and a lack of research on the nutrition and child feeding knowledge of international healthcare workers in the area, or particularly those who are educating caregivers with children ages 2 to 5. Previous research posits that merely having access to healthy food is not enough. Identifying the knowledge, access, and factors influencing feeding habits is important for the well-being of children, families, and communities, and may provide an answer to bettering the global malnutrition condition. Which brings me to the purpose of my study. So I performed a qualitative study to examine the nutrition and young child feeding knowledge and education of Kia region nurses and how they served as educators to provide Ghanaian mothers and caregivers information on child feeding. Okay, so to further explore my purpose, I had a number of objectives. For one, did they have education in nutrition and child feeding? And if so, what was it comprised of? Were they able to keep current on their education? And if so, how so? How were they acting as educators in their clinics? How confident were they in acting as this role of educator? And also, what were some challenges and limitations in this process? To answer this question, I performed in-depth interviews, both in groups and one-on-one, as is displayed in this photo. My interviews were audio recorded and photos were taken, and my interviews followed a structured questionnaire of both close-ended and open-ended questions. Some of my close-ended questions were demographics, height, weight, age, etc. Also, I assessed some of their nutrition knowledge, such as up to what age should you exclusively breastfeed. I asked about a number of years in nursing school, a number of nutrition and child feeding classes during nursing school and since completing nursing school. My open-ended questions generally followed themes of breastfeeding, complementary feeding, iron deficiency anemia, hygiene, and young child feeding practices. Some open-ended question examples were describe how you educate about breastfeeding or about complementary feeding. I pilot tested my questionnaire with 2 registered nurses here in the United States, as well as a child feeding expert and a Ghanaian nutrition and child feeding expert. And I tested for understanding, cultural appropriateness, and accuracy. My study was approved by the IRB here at U of I, as well as the regional clinic director in the Kia region. The participants signed an informed consent and received an incentive of a pen upon completing the interviews. Sorry, my interruption.
Gotta make a grand entrance.
It's okay.
Stylishly late, sorry.
You want me to recap?
No.
Okay, so my participants were nurses, and they were specifically the nurses at specific health clinics that had been involved in previous research. So there were 41 nurses, and there were 12 public health clinics in the Kia region. And I couldn't have performed my research without Mr. Jonathan Kesey. He was my focal person. He was my man on the ground. He took me to every single clinic. He introduced me to every single nurse. He set up all of the interviews. And my research would not have been a success without his help. And for data analysis, as I said, all of my interviews were audio recorded. So I transcribed all of the audio recordings. From the closed-ended categorical questions, I calculated means and frequencies. And from the open-ended questions, I analyzed my transcriptions for pertinent themes. And to do this, I employed an open coding process, which essentially was reading and rereading and rereading again all of my transcriptions and looking for common phrases, looking for common themes, and then categorizing those themes into what turned out for me to be 5 cohesive major themes. And within the study, there were a number of limitations. For one, the use of interviews is inherently a limitation. They're 100% based on what's reported during that time period and what the nurses can remember. So anything that's not said can't be assessed. Additionally, while it was a purposive sample, meaning I wanted nurses within these specific clinics, it was a convenience sample. So results from the study cannot be inferred to the rest of Ghana or Africa or the world. Also, the interviews were conducted in English, which was not the primary language of most of my participants. There were some questions that were not understood. Sometimes the second nurse would interpret or translate the question, and I couldn't verify the accuracy of any translations because they were done in native dialects. And also, due to some limited language abilities, some nurses may not have fully expressed what they wanted to say. And finally, I originally intended all of my interviews to be done one-on-one. But due to time constraints and the comfort level of some nurses, I had to do many interviews in groups. And within a group, you inevitably have someone who talks more and someone who talks less, and some views may not have been expressed due to the group settings. So for my results, with my demographics, in total I did 21 interviews with 41 nurses. 40 of my nurses were female and 1 was male. They ranged in age from 24 to 50 years, and they were mostly from the Akan tribe, which was the major tribe in the Kier region of Ghana. All but one nurse held a 2-year training certificate, and then the one other nurse held a 4-year degree. 78% of the nurses had attended the Winneba Nurses Training School, which was the nursing school within the Kier region. And 85% of the nurses had completed 1 semester during nursing school of nutrition and child feeding education. So some results from my close-ended questions. I asked nurses what did they learn about nutrition and child feeding during nursing school. And for the most part, they reported a basic nutrition and child feeding knowledge. So they told me about the definition of nutrition. They told me about food groups, micronutrients, macronutrients, conditions of malnutrition. Child feeding practices were mainly formed around breastfeeding and complementary feeding. Additionally, the nurses, for continuing education, they almost entirely went to workshops. And so 78% of my nurses had attended a nutrition workshop, and 66 had attended a child feeding workshop. And this is since completing nursing school. I also asked the nurses how often they're asked about nutrition or child feeding during actual clinic visits. And 100% of the nurses said they're asked about it either at every appointment or a few appointments. But what they went on to further describe is that essentially their clinic days were essentially like a big day of well child check. So they would have a bunch of nurses come and they would check all the child's weight in one day. And before beginning the actual exam times, they would have a health talk. And they would give breastfeeding info and complementary feeding information, talk about immunizations, give out malaria nets, think mosquito nets to prevent malaria, if they had them, and these kind of things. So they said that while the mothers and caregivers would often ask questions during the health talks, they did not always ask questions during the actual exam clinical appointments. And also, the health talks the nurses felt were their primary way of disseminating their nutrition and child feeding knowledge. So one of my close-ended questions was about self-efficacy, and so how confident did the nurses feel educating in areas of breastfeeding, complementary feeding, iron deficiency anemia, encouraging young children to eat, food refusal, and food safety and sanitation. So the purple bar, that's the highest bar in all of them, is the very confident bar. So almost all of my nurses said across the board they were very confident acting as educators in all of these areas. Those that weren't very confident were primarily confident, which was the blue bar. I just had 3 nurses who said they were somewhat confident in complementary feeding and iron deficiency anemia, and 2 nurses said they were not confident as educating in iron deficiency anemia and with food refusal. So this brings us to my major themes and the answers to my open-ended questions. And I'm going to go into every theme in more detail in the coming slides, but just to give you a little overview, I had 5 major themes, and this is the model I developed to capture the Ghanaian nurses' nutrition and child feeding education of caregivers with young children. So my first theme is knowledge, and knowledge was their past and present nutrition and child feeding knowledge. And this led to delivery of information. So what information were they delivering to their clients, and how are they doing it? And then evaluation. So how could the nurses figure out if the caregivers and mothers were following the recommendations? And then barriers. What barriers do the nurses perceive as impeding mothers and caregivers from following the recommendations? All of these together led the nurses to report to me a couple of gaps in their nutrition and child feeding knowledge and education, which finally led to my conclusion of this need for in-depth nutrition and child feeding education. So my first theme, the nurses had basic nutrition and child feeding knowledge, and I analyzed this through answers to my close-ended questions about their nutrition assessment questions and also what they told me they learned in nursing school and after nursing school in their continuing education. And as a whole, they had a pretty decent basic nutrition and child feeding knowledge, especially when you compare it to the World Health Organization guidelines. When you look at the literature produced by the World Health Organization as well as other organizations, the nurses hit on pretty much every bullet point of basic nutrition knowledge. So then looking at their delivery of information. So what information were they talking about and how were they doing so? And I mainly focus on 5 themes. So with breastfeeding, the nurses primarily told me they educated about exclusive breastfeeding. With complementary feeding, they mainly told me they talked about how to prepare the complementary foods. So namely without spices, not making it too spicy, and not preparing it with the family foods. With iron deficiency anemia, nurses mainly educated about which foods contained iron and then to give those to children. They mainly talked about green leafy vegetables and that they're particularly the leaves of the cocoyam plant, which were recommended to feed to children with a lot of frequency. And also what I really appreciated and what was mentioned throughout my research is the nurses really focused on recommending foods that were available in the villages and that they felt that families could afford. With food safety and sanitation, this is mainly education on hand washing and using clean water. And then with child feeding practices, almost across the board, the nurses focused on how to get children attracted to the food. And the primary method of doing this was by offering food in colorful bowls. So this quote from one nurse states, "We tell them that they should feed the child with colored bowls, spoons, and the food should be colorful, like palm oil. When they see that the food is colored something like that, flowers like something, it'll encourage them to eat it." So as far as how they delivered the information, like I said before, mainly it was in the form of health talks. And if not in a health talk, they used visual aids, songs, and food demonstrations. So evaluation. How do the nurses know whether or not the mothers and caregivers are following the recommendations? And they did this by checking the child's weight. When the mothers and caregivers brought the children to those clinics, they would see if it was going up or going down and take their conclusion from there. Additionally, the nurses went and did home visits to see children in their natural environments, and they received feedback from the mothers and caregivers. And as one nurse put it, they learn from us and we also learn from them. And there were a number of perceived barriers as to why the nurses felt that mothers and caregivers either could not or would not implement the recommendations. And the first of which were attitudes. So nurses reported a frustration that mothers and caregivers just didn't want to follow their recommendations or just didn't want to listen. I asked one nurse, "So what do you want to know more about?" And she says, "How to convince mothers to accept what we are telling them to do," which pretty much summarizes a complaint from many educators, but particularly the Okay, so the second barrier, poverty. This is definitely a very impoverished area. And like I said before, the nurses really tried to recommend foods that were affordable and were available in the local areas. But even so, mothers and caregivers did complain, according to the nurses, they complained quite often of not being able to afford the recommended foods. There are a couple of studies done in Ghana with children living in impoverished environments that show that children living in impoverished households with caregivers that employ good child feeding practices were thriving versus children in similar impoverished environments with caregivers not employing good child feeding practices who were failing to thrive. Additionally, knowledge levels were a barrier, mothers and caregivers not understanding what the nurses were telling them. And finally, a number of cultural beliefs that the nurses believed were a barrier. And one example is with breastfeeding education. many nurses reported to me that mothers and caregivers believed that one breast held water and the other breast held food. And so they would feed the child from one side or the other depending on what they felt the child needed. And this had a couple of implications. One, children didn't get full, and then two, the mothers were emptying their breasts and so they would get mastitis or other infections per my nurse's reports. So we're moving on to my final theme. So once we look at the nurses' overall knowledge and then what kind of information they're giving out and how they're doing it and how they can tell whether or not their recommendations are being followed, and then what are the barriers to people, to the nurses or to the mothers and caregivers following the recommendations, the nurses reported a couple of gaps in their nutrition and young child feeding education and knowledge. One, it was that the nurses, 39% of the nurses desired more nutrition knowledge. So particularly about children's nutrient needs and exactly what foods contain these nutrients that they could then give or recommend be given to children. Secondly, 49% desired more young child feeding education, so more about young child feeding practices and more about food refusal. And the nurses primarily wanted to have this information come in the form of workshops. Workshops were their main way of receiving any education once they finished nursing school. As one nurse put it, well, if they don't organize workshops, mostly don't hear anything about it. So they should organize the workshops more often. So this kind of shows that the nurses have this need and a desire for in-depth nutrition knowledge and greater young child feeding knowledge and education. So when you look at the educational materials put out by the World Health Organization and other large agencies like the UN or UNICEF or USAID or the FAO, they promote the use of child feeding practices up to age 5, and in some reports that I read up to age 7. So they really promote this as a way to improve child health outcomes. But then when you look at the actual educational materials, most child feeding practices are just about breastfeeding and complementary feeding, and they really don't go beyond the age of 2. So this kind of gap in the educational literature out there was also mirrored in the nurses' gap in their child feeding knowledge past the age of 2. Implications for practice. So there is a need for further research in the nutrition and child feeding knowledge and education for international healthcare workers, particularly nurses, as they are often in this role of the primary educator. Secondly, it's important to understand the relationship between the educator and those being educated in order to effectively provide education. And finally, for international healthcare workers, there is this ultimate need for greater child feeding knowledge that goes beyond breastfeeding and beyond complementary feeding to influence child health outcomes for children 2 to 5 years of age. And that's it. References if anybody wants to ask. And I can take questions.
And I just want to explain a little bit that I missed before. So how it works is we're going to have an open opportunity where everyone can ask questions for Jenny related to the work she's done. And then that'll be about 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and then I'm going to ask everyone to leave, and it'll be the time for her committee to sit down and talk with Jenny and ask her specific questions that the committee has identified. And then she is brought back in for the verdict.
Yeah.
Let's just throw it out there. So please, we welcome any questions for Jenny and what she's done. And do you want it still recording?
You can, yeah, you
Okay.
can flip that.